Good morning. Welcome to First Edition, the online ministry of First Community Church. My name is Glenn Miles. I'm the senior minister here in this congregation, and we are thrilled that you have joined us for worship on this day. We want you to know, no matter who you are, where you're from, where you may be going, what you believe or what you don't believe, you, as you are welcomed and accepted here in this church. Right now, there's a QR code up on your screen. We'd love for you to use your camera option on your phone and capture that code, click on the link, and then register your attendance, share a prayer concern if you have one, give for the offering if you'd like to, and also notice that there are a couple of links to our weekly emails. These weekly emails contain information about all the ministries in the life of this church. There's a lot going on, even in the summer, and I know we have something for you. So take a moment to read through those, will you please? My sermon today is titled, Watch What God Does. It's based on a text in the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4 and 5. In the middle of that beautiful word, Paul says to his congregation, be kind and tenderhearted. Imagine what that might mean to you and me if we could take that simple but clear instruction and apply it to our own lives. My family, my community, I can guarantee you the folks I interact with, if we all learn to be kind and tenderhearted with each other, it would change things in a wonderful way. Well, I have more to say about this in the sermon. Let's go together and worship God.
There's a God who sees. There's a God who sees. There's a God who sees right where you are. There's a God who sees. There's a God who sees. There's a God who sees right where you are.
God's love is strong, it won't let go. God holds us in God's sacred heart. And even when we're far from home,
There's a God who sees right where you are. There's a sees. There's a God who sees. There's a God who sees right where you are.
Kindness will save the church. I know it sounds simple, but stay with me. Kindness will save the church. One of my favorite theologians and scholars is a man named Tom Wright. He says at the heart of the passage that John just read for us is the reminder that kindness matters. That sometimes Christians and churches, entire congregations, forget that the essence of the gospel of Jesus Christ is kindness, grace, and mercy. Now, theology matters, beliefs matter, how we organize our church, that's important. Setting up clear and appropriate boundaries to keep people safe, yes, all of that matters. But all of that hinges on the simple idea that kindness is at the heart and center of who we are in the church. Because kindness will save the church. Years ago when I was in Kansas City, I heard a story from another pastor about a man whose wife was taken from his life, who lost his wife at a very early age. They were deeply, madly in love. Somewhere around the 14th or 15th year of their marriage, in their early 40s, she was killed in a terrible and horrific way. When the funeral service was over, he asked for a few moments from his pastor. The pastor had done a marvelous job leading the service. The congregation had turned out in large numbers to support their friend and his family. But the man walked into the pastor's office and said, "After what happened to my wife, I no longer believe in God. I'm done," he said. He said, "I'm not angry with the church. I'm not angry with you, Pastor. I'm not upset in any way at my friends here in the church, but I'm done with God. There cannot be a God. If there is a God, how in the world could God let my wife die like that?" And he formally left the church, and he gave up his belief completely in God. He moved away from that community, moved to a new place, started a new job, tried to live his life in honor and memory of his wife, who was a kind, gracious, and loving person. So everything he did in her memory and in her honor. But after a couple of years in this new community, he began to notice there was a little church. He hadn't noticed it at first. There was a little church that he drove by every morning on his way into his office and every day on his way back home. And one morning, almost without thinking about it, on a Sunday, he took a shower, shaved, cleaned up, put on some clothes, and drove to that church. Got there about 5 minutes after the service had started, sat in the back, did not know anybody, did not know anything about the church, just sat there in the back row. The sermon was well done. He appreciated the service itself. The music was beautiful. Everything was fine. And they just kind of hung around afterwards. Didn't talk to anybody really, just stood in the back and observed and waited till the pastor was free. And he went up to this pastor who he'd never met before and said, "Can I tell you my story? Do I have a moment or two?" And the pastor said, "Of course you may." He said, "I want you to know that I appreciated your sermon. It was well done. There was thoughtfulness in the music and the preparation of the service. I don't know why, but I showed up today even though I do not believe in God. My wife was killed in a terrible, terrible way, and I've given up my complete belief in God. But I wanted you to know that about me, and it's okay for me to come back." And the pastor said, "Of course it is. You're always welcome here, whether you believe or don't believe." The man started to attend week after week after week. Months went by when the man had turned in a pledge card and he got engaged in some of the service activities. And for all intents and purposes, even though he was not formally a member, he was as active as anybody else had been, at least for the last several months. And so the pastor called him up and said, "I want to go out to coffee with you. Can we meet?" And he said, "Yes, I'll be glad to talk to you." And before the pastor could say anything, he wanted to find out what was going on in this man's life. Before the pastor could say anything, the man said, "Now, please know, I know I've been coming to church a lot. I still don't believe in God. I want to be clear about that." The pastor said in a gentle voice, "Then tell me, I'm just curious, why do you continue to attend?" And the man smiled and said, "Because when I leave church, or I leave the Wednesday night dinner, or I leave the Saturday afternoon of service, I feel better because everyone is so kind. Kindness will save the church." Now, theology matters, beliefs matter, how we structure and treat each other, all those things matter. Essentially, at the end of the day, though, without kindness, how do we even bother with theology? It's kindness that will save the church. And I know that sounds simple. And John and I have gone to seminary and got degrees and studied, and I'm sure John's been to workshops like I've been to workshops on church growth. I've led some of those workshops myself on church growth, on raising funds, on building a staff, all that sort of thing. All that is important. But at the end of the day, no matter how much money you raise, no matter how great your staff might be, how skilled they are, if there's not kindness at the heart, at the center of the congregation, I can tell you this, that church is on its way to decline. That church is on its way to closing its doors. I'm thinking this morning of a workshop that I attended in 2022, in January of 2022. It was held in Kansas City at the church I used to serve. They invited pastors in congregations like First Community to come from all around the country to be there and participate in 3 days of workshops. And the keynoter happened to be my friend Adam Hamilton, who's a pastor at a large church there in Kansas City. I went mostly to see my friends, and I've been a friend of Adam's for 20 years, and I thought, there's nothing he can teach me. But then there were 5 lectures that he gave, and they were really pretty good. And I remember him talking about raising funds and doing this and how to build your staff and all these kinds of issues. It was great, very helpful for me. And then at one point he said in his lecture, you as pastors are called to help your church incarnate the body of Christ in the world. Now that's a $100 theological word that simply means be like Jesus. When your church does what Arthur was singing about, when it does what Samuel was singing about, when your church incarnates those actions, those ways of being in the world through our care ministers, we are becoming Jesus in the church. We are bringing Jesus' body to life again. It's like the resurrection's happening again and again and again because kindness matters. At the end of the day, the instruction to be kind matters. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but have you ever been a jerk? I take that as maybe a yes, perhaps. I just ordered a new book this week by a rather provocative author named John Pavlovitz. The title is, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. Now, I haven't read the book yet, but that's a pretty good start. I'm going to get t-shirts made up that say, If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. You can buy them in the church merch store for $150,000 each. If God is love, don't be a jerk. And here's the problem. We're not going to take time to confess our stuff right now. We don't need to. I think you already have, frankly. But we forget easily, don't we, that simple instruction to be kind. Back in 1994, I was playing in an unbelievably important basketball game. Why are you laughing? There were going to be maybe 8 or 9 fans watching this game. It was the Church League Championship of San Diego. Our team was undefeated. We'd played really well. We lost one, we didn't lose any games. We were undefeated. Oh, we almost lost to the team we were playing in the championship game. We beat them in overtime. My brother Dave, who was an all-state player in high school, an all-state player in junior college, an all-conference player in college, was the star of our team. We had 2 plays. Pass the ball to Dave and pass the ball to Dave. Yes, you know my brother, yes. And because of that, we were very good. Well, it was a tight game, back and forth all the way through, and then we won. It was great. Got in the car with Julie and our son Nate, who was the 2 of the 9 fans that were there. Nate was in the back seat. He was 4 years old, strapped into his car seat. And as we're driving home, Nate says, Daddy, why did you yell at that man during the game? Now, I wanted to explain to Nate the nuances of the game. To help him understand that sometimes the officials, he was talking about the referee, sometimes the officials need some advice and some guidance. And in a rough and tumble game like this, they might make a mistake. And Dave Parsons knows this. I was just trying to explain to the referee, here's what's going on. Before I could say all of that, Julie said, it's because your dad's a hyper-competitive jerk. It's a true story. And Nate in the back, who was our oldest and our only at the point, goes, Daddy's a hyper-competitive jerk. Daddy's a hyper-competitive. Yeah, it was a lovely moment. And the lesson was learned. I think. The lesson was learned. There's some thought that Paul might have been an athlete. In a letter to a man named Timothy, a young pastor that had been mentored by Paul, Paul is kind of winding up his own career in ministry. He knows that the end might be close. And he says, I've run the good race. I've fought the good fight. Some people think Paul may have been a wrestler because he uses some of those kind of terms that you find in wrestling. Don't know for sure, but if he was an athlete, there's no doubt that he probably then did see some jerky behavior out on the athletic fields on a time or two, but he wouldn't have to be an athlete. He wouldn't have to go to any athletic events. After all, he founded churches all over the Mediterranean. He'd seen enough to know that sometimes the worst behavior is among folks who profess a completely different way of living. Sometimes, not all the time. His letter to the Ephesians is interesting. It's probably not written to a particular congregation. Now, when he writes, for example, 1 Corinthians 1 and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, those are to specific people in a specific church with specific issues. And he names those issues, and here's how to deal with them theologically. The Ephesians letter seems to be sent out not just to one place, but to a general region. How many of you have been to Ephesus? Some of you have been to Ephesus? Some of you have been there? It's a beautiful place. I highly recommend it if you ever get a chance to. It's on the west coast of Turkey. And all along that west coast of what we now call Turkey, there were many churches founded. And the thought is this letter was sent to all these different churches and it was to be read in public worship. And the first 3 chapters are Paul's basic theological treatise and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And he says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, because of God's mercy and love, we're made alive in Christ by grace. That's pretty close to exactly what it says in the Greek. Pretty close. Because of God's love and mercy, we're made alive in the grace of Christ. It's a beautiful statement. I might get another t-shirt with that printed on it as well. It's a beautiful statement. But after chapter 3, Paul gets very practical. It's almost like somebody after the first 3 chapters raised his hand and said, Apostle Paul, this is wonderful, but it's all theological and abstract. Tell us how to practice it, put this into practice. Well, you heard the advice that John read this morning. All those wonderful things. At the heart of the text is at the heart of the sermon. Be kind and tenderhearted. Be kind and tenderhearted. It's such a lovely sentiment, such a clear idea. Sometimes, though, when I see that, I wonder to myself, is this really as powerful and as strong as it can be? I mean, after all, if I'm being kind and tenderhearted and someone's pushing me through and pushing me down and going after me and attacking me, don't I have a right to kind of come back at them too? Shouldn't I be able to let them have it if need be? I mean, after all, they're speaking in a rage, calling me a name. Don't I have the right to go after them? Be kind and tenderhearted. Do some of you remember the Reverend Paul Balmer? Raise your hand if you remember Paul. A lot of you do. What a kind and gentle soul he was. He was semi-retired when he and his wife Jan became members of this church, and Dick Wing, my predecessor, did a brilliant thing. He hired Paul to be the minister to the staff. Paul was a retired United Church of Christ pastor, a big burly guy, about 6'3", 6'4", with this amazing baritone voice that could fill the sanctuary without a sound system, didn't need it. And yet he was one of the kindest, most gracious persons you could ever meet, a wonderful pastor to the staff. He's in the resurrection now, and I'm sure he's glorying in the presence of God. But I miss Paul. I miss him because I remember his story. That 50 years ago, when Paul was a young pastor in the United Church of Christ in places like Texas and other locations, he was beaten and psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually beaten up and bruised. Not physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He was bruised and bloody. Why? Because he dared to stand up against racism. Because he dared to stand up against homophobia. And those churches, some of those churches, not everyone, not all the people in all the churches, but many of them treated him horribly and terribly, pushed him aside in things that we today take for granted as no longer being real issues that at least we have to worry about in this congregation or in this church. Paul was a trailblazer, blazing the way for pastors like me to come along a few years later, and pastors like John and others to continue to lead in that way. Thinking about Paul reminds me of a sermon I heard in my mid-30s when I was in Atlanta. I was 36 years old. I was the youngest pastor in the history of that church. We were really going to get on fire for Jesus, and we were going to fight racism. We were going to fight all these things. I was really anxious to get going and pushing hard. I was pushing way too hard. And then I went to this workshop for young pastors in their 30s, black and white pastors. And the preacher at the opening worship service was this long-tenured African-American pastor, kind of built like Paul, big man with a big booming voice. And he said to us, I need to tell you young pastors a story. I know you're excited. I know you have skills, but let me tell you a story about a man I was mentoring 2 years ago. This man had just gotten out of seminary. He was obviously gifted, homiletically brilliant, great organizational skills, a marvelous pastor. He was anxious to get ready, anxious to get going, and he was pushing on me to sign off on the papers. And I said, young man, before I sign on these papers, I want you, in quiet and in private, to humbly fall on your knees and thank God for the women and the men who've been pounding on the door of racism for 50 years, for 100 years, for the women and men, black women and men in this country, in this culture, who have literally bloodied their knuckles and their hands, bruised their hands, fighting against it. Before you start your ministry, fall on your knees and thank God for them. That's who Paul Balmer was. Before I ever began, he was fighting that fight. He was fighting that good fight, running that good race. I'm talking about my friend Paul Balmer. He was fighting that fight and running that good race. And what's most amazing, and this is why I'm telling you that story, is all the vitriol he received, all the hatred that came at him, all the pushback that he took on because he was fighting against racism and homophobia, all of that he took on, none of it changed who he was. None of it caused him to lash back. None of it caused him to reach out and get into name calling or anything else, because he was the Reverend Paul Baumer, a minister in the Church of Jesus Christ, and nothing that came at him could change that simple fact. Kindness will save the church. Kindness will give us the strength to stand together against whatever comes at us. Kindness does not mean we're perfect. You're not perfect, I'm not perfect, but kindness will gently call us to ask for forgiveness, to seek out grace. Kindness will give us the courage then to stand together, to hold the other accountable, to being kind in a world filled with raging voices, voices that cause dismay, voices that seek to divide, voices that seek to put down and belittle. Those voices cannot define us or who we are, because in the name of Jesus Christ, let me be as clear as I can. Kindness will save the church. And the people of God said,
When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. I see my brother. I see my brother, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother. Forgiveness in the garment of our courage, the power to make the peace we long to know. Open up our eyes to see the wounds that bind all of humankind. May our shuddered hearts greet the dawn of life, charity and love. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother, I see my brother.
us your ways. Teach us your ways as we learn from one another. Learn to love each other. Teach us your ways. Teach us to give. Teach us to give. Give ourselves to one another. Learn to love each other. Teach us to give. Teach us to weep. Teach us to weep. Let us weep with one another. Learn to love each other. Teach us to weep. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Let us learn from one another. Learn to love each other. Teach us your